Hey, 1, 2.
Teaching Learning Complex. Lecture Theater. A2. Emergency Briefing. The University of the West Indies places high priority on preserving your health and safety. Please give me your attention for a few moments as I outline the emergency procedures to be followed at today's event. This building is equipped with a fire alarm system, and in the event of an emergency the alarm will sound. There are no planned drills for today. So if the alarm sounds, we will treat it as a real emergency. Once the alarm has sounded, calmly make your way through the exit. There are 2 exits, which are clearly marked. One is located to the front east of the room, and one to the back of the room. Take a moment to identify the exits. Once outside the room, make your way to the ground floor, and exit through one of the 2 emergency exits located east of the building, then continue north through the pedestrians gate, to the assembly area located at the back of the Department of Behavioral Sciences. Stay at the assembly area, and await further instructions. In the event of an earthquake, stay calm, and look out for falling debris. Once the shaking stops, exit the building in a calm and orderly manner, and assemble at the assembly area. Thank you. Teaching Learning Complex. Lecture.
I know you would all be very calm and avoid the debris. Mr. Robert Bermudez, Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Professor Indar Ramnarayan, Deputy Campus Principal, the UWI St. Augustine Campus. Sir David Adjaye and Lady Adjaye, Ashley Shaw Scott, members of the UWI St. Augustine Executive Management Team, executives of the Answer McCall Group and Abel Building Solutions Limited, Professor Edwin Ekwe, Dean, Faculty of Engineering, the UWI St. Augustine, Mr. Ronald Ammon, President, Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects, other specially invited guests, members of the media. Good afternoon to all. I am Professor Christine Carrington. I'm Chair of the UWI St. Augustine Campus Open Lectures Committee, and I'm your Master of Ceremonies for this afternoon's proceedings. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this distinguished open lecture by Sir David Adjaye. We are very, very pleased to be hosting you. Now, the role of the Open Lectures Committee is to advance the university's knowledge transfer agenda via high-quality lectures by exceptional local, regional, and international speakers. The Distinguished Lecture Series is just one of the platforms that our campus uses to engage the wider national community on issues relevant to local and regional development, to impact regional policy making, and to stimulate and encourage the pursuit of excellence. We also host professorial inaugural lectures to showcase the research of our recently appointed or promoted professors. Now, over the years, we have had a diverse selection of very knowledgeable and engaging speakers, all at the forefront of their fields. But I suspect that this is the first time that we've had a speaker who is routinely and in all sincerity referred to as a superstar. We are really truly delighted to have engaged Sir David, and we look forward to hearing his insights into building publics. At this point, I would like to invite Professor Indar Ramnarayan, Deputy Campus Principal, to deliver opening remarks. Please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you very much, Professor Carrington. Mr. Robert Bermudez, well, I can't see you. Okay, so I can see you now. Mr. Robert Bermudez, Chancellor, UWI, and Ms. Usha Rani Maharaj, Sir David Adjaye, this evening's guest speaker, and Lady Adjaye, executives of the Anser McCall Group of Companies, Mr. Ronald Amon, President, Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects, Professor Edwin Ekwe, Dean, Faculty of Engineering, Mr. Mark Raymond, Architect and Lecturer, Faculty of Engineering, Mr. Frank Sudin, Campus Librarian, members of the Open Lecture Committee, other colleagues of UWI St. Augustine Campus, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome all of you to this evening's distinguished open lecture by a remarkable scientist, remarkable architect, Sir David Adjaye. On behalf of UWI St. Augustine Campus, I extend a special welcome to you, Sir David. We are honored to have this opportunity to host you at this campus in this forum. We deeply appreciate that you have agreed to present this afternoon on the theme, Building Publics. Through activities such as public lectures, the UWI seeks to create a multidimensional enabling environment that engages the academic community and contributes informed discourse and analysis to the public. This aligns with the university's mission and commitment to positively transform the Caribbean. This transformation that is driven by education, research, and innovation is expected to propel the development of the region's economies, among other areas. It is anticipated that this regional transformation would also cause a shift in the goals and needs of society. As a result, the demands on the built environment and public and social spaces will also shift. Therefore, in the near future, there will be the need to rethink the design of buildings that play a vital role in the lives of this region's citizens. The architectural principles and resultant infrastructure that cater to the needs of the region's citizens will also need to be reconfigured. Great architecture in this region will not only need to be aesthetically pleasing and environmentally friendly, but also support long-term development of regional communities. This will require fresh and radically new ideas from this region's architects, engineers, and those in related fields. Therefore, it is with great enthusiasm that we welcome this evening's presentation. It promises to offer a leading expert's perspective on creating civic buildings with communities in mind. I'm confident that Sir David's knowledge and experience will provide us with important insights. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for supporting this evening's lecture. And I see all spaces are almost fully occupied, only standing room left. So this is a great achievement, Christine. Thank you for that. So we are happy to have in attendance so many architects, designers, engineers, those in related fields, as well as observers. I'm grateful to the Open Lecture Committee's commendable efforts to maintain the intellectual vibrancy of this campus. I'm aware that this is a collaborative effort, so I must say thank you to the Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects and the Board of Architecture of Trinidad and Tobago for partnering with the UWI to make this effort successful. Colleagues, students, members of the public, I encourage you to continue to support the future scholarly activities of the UWI, and especially the Open Lecture Series. This semester's Open Lecture Series have been quite fascinating, and there are even more really good talks ahead. I hope that you enjoy this evening's lecture. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Professor Ramnarine. I am now going to invite Mr. Ronald Amon, the president of the Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects, to make some brief remarks. Please welcome him to the stage.
Mr. Robert Bermudez, Chancellor, the University of the West Indies, Professor Indar Ramnarine, Deputy Campus Principal, the UWI St. Augustine, Sir David Adjaye and Lady Adjaye, members of the UWI St. Augustine Executive Management Team, executives of the Anser McCall Group and Abel Building Solutions Limited, Professor Edwin Ekwe, Dean Faculty of Engineering, the University of St. Augustine, our specialty invited guest, members of the media. It is indeed a privilege to be here today to listen to the upcoming lecture by architect Sir David Adjaye. David's insightful and original solutions to architectural challenges have won him countless awards, from the RIBA Bronze Medal as a student in 1990 to his knighthood in 2017, and numerous high-profile public projects while competing against some of the world's most renowned architects. But what is it that distinguishes his public works and warrants respect and admiration, particularly in the Caribbean? Well, at first glance, we may be prompted to say that his designs are extraordinary or unique, but that could be said of many of his contemporaries. Furthermore, these terms do not always connotate a successful design. For instance, while browsing most architectural magazines or websites that display particularly prominent projects, one may notice the prevalence of design by accomplished architects that portray a style or signature aesthetic. Buildings twist and turn, fold to create undulating forms or swoop into sexy curves, creating seductive renderings that develop into undoubtedly Instagrammable buildings. Admittedly, the application of new computational tools allows us to explore and build forms that were never possible or previously extremely difficult to achieve. But to produce a design that focuses only on expensive parametric forms ignores the full potential of architecture to transform and enrich lives. David's ability to reinterpret established cultural norms and forms using contemporary materials and methods reveals his true genius, and this is why his work is particularly worthy of our examination. His public works demonstrate that a good design is not born in isolation, and the architectural response does not start with the imposition of a particular preconceived form. Rather, it is a product of the deep exploration of multiple complex factors and issues that are relevant to the context and use of the project. His works are imbued with meaning due to a rigorous design process that is grounded in an understanding of the complex history, geography, culture, and regional context of a given project. Therefore, it relates directly to those using it, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status, and this is a major factor that distinguishes his public works. This understanding is particularly applicable in our region, as our limited resources and budgets present considerable strains on design potential. David's role is not only architect, but also sociologist, historian, scientist, and inventor, identifying the underlying themes on which to build his concept, regardless of the project's scale or budget. He expands the dimensions of architecture, prompting us to think in terms of transformation, context, interpretation, and narrative. Materials are used simultaneously as cladding, art, and historical reference, and spatial transitions conjure reflection and contemplation, all governed by sustainability and efficiency. The Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects is honored to co-host this event with the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and the Board of Architecture of Trinidad and Tobago. David, we eagerly await your lecture.
Thank you, Ronald. I'd just like to recognize Mr. Jasper Bopal from the Board of Architecture of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you so much, sir, for the support that you all have given us. Okay, so at this point now, I'm going to invite Professor Edwin Ekwe. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering, and he's going to introduce our featured speaker. Professor Ekwe, please.
Mr. Robert Bermudez, Chancellor UWI, Professor Inda Ramnarayan, Deputy Campus Principal UWI St. Augustine, Sir David Adjaye and Lady Adjaye, members of the UWI St. Augustine Executive Management Team, executives of the Ansa Macau Group and Ebel Building Solutions Limited, Mr. Robert Aman, President, Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects, our specially invited guests, members of the media. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be called upon to introduce our special guest, Sir David Adjaye. Sir David Adjaye, Order of the British Empire, is recognized as a leading architect of the generation. Born in Tanzania to Ghanaian parents, his broadly ranging influences, ingenious use of materials, and sculptural ability have established him as the architect of our time. In 2000, he founded Adjaye Associates, which now has offices in London, New York, and Accra, with projects in the US, UK, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. His largest project to date, the $540 million Smithsonian Institution National Museum of the American African History and Culture, opened on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2016. The museum, which was named Cultural Event of the Year by the New York Times, and the Beasley Design of the Year by the Design Museum. Other prominent completed projects include the Idea Stores in London, which was credited with pioneering a new approach to library services in 2005, the Moscow School of Management in 2010, and the Sugar Hill Mixed Social Housing Scheme in Harlem, in Harlem, New York in 2015. Ongoing projects include a new home for the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, the recently announced National Cathedral of Ghana in Accra, and the National Holocaust Museum and Learning Center in London. Adjaye has amassed numerous accolades for his visionary work, including Design Miami Artist of the Year title in 2011, the Wall Street Journal Inventor Award in 2013, and the 2016 Perennial London Design Medal from the London Design Festival. In 2017, Adjaye received the knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II for services to architecture, and was recognized as one of the 100 most influential people of the year by the Time magazine. A round of applause for him, please. Adjaye has held distinguished professorships at the Harvard University, Princeton University, and Yale University. He has also taught at the Royal College of Art, where he has previously studied, and at the Architectural Association School in London. Without wasting a lot of your time, I now call on Sir David Adjaye, an international and well-acclaimed and well-known and respected architect, to present his moving lecture. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. It's such an incredible privilege and honor to be speaking in front of the university, the Architects Association, my dear friends, family, and all of you who've come to listen. I wanted to sort of make a lecture for you which would try to give you a window into my methodology and process. I mean, I've had so eloquently said the methodology that I use, so I think you have some insights into how my work has evolved. But essentially, I discovered very early on that architecture was potentially a form that could not just make buildings, but really make meaning in our society, and could be something to express the unique specificity of the different continents and the different cultures that are around the world. That was inspiring for me, and maybe that came from my childhood as a young boy who was brought to diplomatic parents and was fortunate enough to be able to move from south of the equator right to the north and experience many cultures and societies before I was even 10. When I started to think about architecture, my practice really formed in London through the classic sort of workload that one gets in London, working in a very historic city, working with preservation, working on a city which is a 1,000-year-old history, and trying to find a way to position oneself in that context and to make meaning for why one should make architecture after such an extraordinary history that the city has. I realized in this time that a way to do it was maybe to also look at myself. And in a way, when I started my practice in 2000, I also started a personal journey, a work. Okay, which way do I point? Am I pointing to? I think this is, yeah. That's okay. I'm sorry. That's okay. I thought it was me, but I'm happy that it's not me. No, that's fine. So, I mean, I could keep going. This idea that somehow, as a young architect, I found myself more interested in trying to find a reason for making architecture, as opposed to just making architecture because one could, was really the big question of my career.
Just use...
Oh, we can use the keyboard, okay. Yeah. Up or down, it's probably this one.
Just him.
Okay. Do you know what? The computer's off. I think the computer's been switched off. So we just need to boot it back on. It may have been unplugged. Maybe we'll just wait for this to get sorted out and then we can just start again.
I apologize on behalf of the University of the West Indies for this little glitch. It will be fixed shortly. It seems something was working before. We'll get it done. You don't know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. I don't know why he's here.
I can see if I can help.
This is the gentleman here.
Yeah. It's there's
It's on. Is this on? Right.
It's on. It's on.
Please. No, I want to see that.
You got to.
Wonderful. Is that working? Okay, well done. It happens everywhere, so don't please think this is in any way. Let's go. I always start with this slide for this thinking. I was obviously born, this is Ghana here, and this is where my family's from, this is where I was born. And when I started to do architecture, I realized that I had really ignored the context of the continent, and I had been sort of programmed to not look at its history. Not look at its history and its evolution. And that we have the tech jinx in here. So traditionally, this is how we all understand the image of the continent. And I spent basically from 2000 to 2011, as I started my career, I decided that I was going to visit every single country on the continent, all 54. Is that okay? You want to? It's sort of echoing. But Mike? Yeah. It's okay? It's okay? All right. So I decided to, with my team, look at a way to think about the continent, not just in terms of its geography, but also in terms of its cultures and its evolution. A drawing that we made looked at a satellite map, which this is the satellite map of the continent. This is about a decade ago, where you understand how the forest region and savannas are in the center here, the Great Lakes are coming through here, and really the deserts and the plains are really a sort of a large part of the continental plate. The sort of Great Water, the Great Lakes, and the Rift Valley obviously are here, and the Maghreb, the fragment of Europe, is sort of in this place here. I suddenly realized the beauty of this incredible continent is that it actually has the 6 quintessential geographies, and that do you want me to go close or far? Is that okay? I can just stay where, okay. So, this idea that somehow one could explore a continent where all the geographies of the planet are in specific zones, and that in each of those zones there is a human habitation which has adapted itself over 10,000 years to create its cultures and its roots, seemed immediately to me as a way of returning back to a primary understanding of how habitation has happened and how architecture has happened, and a way to think about how one maybe might move forward. This is a map and a drawing that we made of the continent without territories and borders, and as a regional sort of description, looking at the great rivers where the main settlements of the people of the continent are. The Sahel, the deserts, the mountains are in the purple. These are the high points. The Rift Valley, which is in this kind of high plains area here. Sort of unfolded, and to understand that the cities of the continent are essentially mostly on the perimeter, and when they were inland, they were obviously strategic from either colonial times or empire times to do with relationships to bodies of water and trade routes. You might know this or not, but essentially there are 10 cities in the mountain regions of the continent, and they are essentially north-south along the Rift Valley. And if this is the cradle of humankind, this is really sort of some of the early sort of cities of the world. And what they look like now, when I went to each country, I really specifically looked at the capitals, and I wanted to look at the morphology of the architecture to see how, even with industrialization, even with modernity, what impact these particular geographies were having on the way in which architecture was being made. And just generically, one would only look maybe at specificity, like the Italian colonization, or the English colonization, or certain indigenous qualities. But one started to, as a body, realized that there was something else starting to happen when you started to map these, and I'll show you as I go along. In the savanna and grasslands, which is really, the great plains where the animal kingdom is, the image that most people have of Africa, there are 6 cities. And they are really, you realize, this horizontality, but where there's fertility and wealth, you get a kind of verticality, but essentially you're in this grassland and sort of horizontal landscape, which is where the alluvial sort of eruptions predominantly happen, very fertile, but very thin on large vegetation, and very rich and good for the animal kingdom, which is why that's where the parks are, that's where the animals are, that's where the migrations happen. And that's where those cities and those nomadic populations have been. And then you realize that the forest is predominantly where most of the countries and cities of the continent are. And they are all interlinked from the Nile right down to the Congo, the Zambezi. They are all interlinked onto these river networks. And that's where the agrarian settlements happened. The cultures of those settlements evolved. And now there are also strategic city destinations, both offering a bucolic aspect or strategic aspect to those nations. And the forest regions are dense, lush, humid, rich. A word that I use, supernatural almost in their nature, and where the greatest amount of people are on the continent. And where they're even on islands, you still have, even though it's a more aqueous image, you still have this image of this forest culture that I think is prevalent. And in the Sahel, you have only four cities, and 2 of them are on rivers, 3 of them on rivers, 1 on the coast, and 1 in the center, in Niamey in Niger, which is a strategic position in the middle of the desert, part of the trade routes between the east and the west, historically. And you start to get from the fertility of the river belt right through to the deserts and to the Sahel, this sort of junction between the two. And then, of course, in the desert, you really don't have any settlements, and the settlements that are sort of geographically located are either on the coast or on the Nile, specifically. And you see how the Nile obviously is the kind of great birth of civilization of the continent, and still is the great sort of source and meaning of its modern cities. The coast, the Red Sea, Djibouti is an extraordinary port, Khartoum, the Nile, the White Nile, at the base of what we know the traditional Nile is, and then now Chad, Mauritania on the Atlantic coast. I've sort of rushed through this in sort of quickly, but this is an 11-year study, and I would go by myself and I would document essentially each of these places, and would never go with a guide, would always take a taxi with a taxi driver, and I would pay him for his time, and would spend whatever time it needed to document these cities and to look at the typologies. The last, of course, is the Maghreb in the north, with this sort of very extraordinary fragment, which is geographically connected to Europe, and the sort of 4 cities in that place. I ended up making a large sort of tomb, as it were, of all this work, in a way to try and sort of speak about using everyday photography to try and speak about a way in which one could reimagine the notion of specificity in geography through the documentation of the topologies of architecture of a place, just through simple photography, unprofessional. When that was happening, I think that that's important for you to understand that in that time also I was building the critical work of my career. So between working in London, I was always traveling to the continent and doing that research. So hopefully that gives you a background frame to the thinking. My first project on the continent, shortly after I finished that study, was a house that I made in Ghana, my home country, for an amazing man, Kofi Annan, who recently passed, who saw my research and asked me to make a project for him on the coast near where his family came from, a village in Goma Feta, which is outside Accra, on the Atlantic coast. And he'd bought a piece of land very close to that village and wanted me to make a special retreat for him. A place that he would obviously just be able to sort of rest, but also a place where he wanted to bring leaders from the world or thinkers to be able to make a sort of public home, a home that would be for intellectuals and visitors, but also a place that would somehow also speak about the specificity of being in this particular location, but also something that was about looking forward into the future. We made one agreement that we would try to not use a single luxury material. That was the brief. I went back to looking at the indigenous architecture of the communities, the way in which essentially this incredible ecological architecture, still unbeaten by anyone with all our technology, is essentially from the earth and returns to the earth, and probably the best carbon footprint we can possibly ever have. But essentially, what is emotional about this work for me is also the fact that it simply presents a direct extension of the ground into form and habitation. And that also in West Africa, because of the nature of the climate, an architecture, a cellular architecture, develops after the sort of rural rotunda architecture and its sort of empire stages. A cellular architecture develops which is based essentially on networks of geometric volumes which interlock to create either courtyards when they're dense or network fields to create territories when they're not, when they're more in the landscape. And I drew great inspiration in that and to try and see if I could make a project where the very form and the materiality would climatically mitigate the context, but also create an urban form, a tessellated urban form that would speak to the roots of this agglomerating strategy, but also offer a new way of tessellating, which is a 21st century. It was a sort of early idea, but also now a sort of 21st century tessellating or pixelating strategy in terms of the forms. What was basically in program terms essentially about 30,000 square foot worth of accommodation was broken into 9 volumes that created the network for the house. The final sort of plan is really this idea of a sort of series of service buildings, 3 public buildings, which are 3 geometries interlinked and to make a sort of front, 3 private residences that interlink, and then a sort of research studio, and then sort of games, fields, and landscape, which would then grow around it. It would have its own agriculture, farming, etc. It's a completely self-sustained network, and then would have the longest path for the very important discussions of any diplomat, if you know anything about how diplomats work. Walking and talking are the best ways to create peaceful situations. And that's something that Kofi absolutely stressed. The house really was about making these loops, making this journey, and to eventually what he wanted to do was to cultivate this entire landscape into an incredible set of gardens with these volumes interspersed between it to make this world. What's been amazing to see is when we've had the great fortune to spend time with him and his family and friends here, how the house works as a place to be able to retreat, but also to aggregate together, and how he imagined the use of this as a kind of model has been incredibly inspiring to me. This idea of a one-room volume in each geometry is the idea of the plan. There are no corridors because we are in the tropics, but we have covered interlocking systems, so a living space, a working space, this is a private bedroom space, and then these retreats here. The divisions are really furniture-based, so they're really about the way in which you divide the single-room volume, and then the service quarters at the back. The lower sections, which deal with supporting and servicing the public parts of the house, and the idea that the architecture is elevated above the ground to allow groundwater to be collected into storm drains, not sort of wedded into the ground, but elevated to allow the ground plane to do its own work. Sectionally, the volumes are very simple roofs. They are reduced essentially to the roof, the floor, and the necessary wall to support. They're moment structures, for those of you engineers, so that there's no bracing required. We use sort of heavily reinforced joints, and the materiality is a sort of concrete an earth mix, and we worked with local earth pigments and dyes to get a range of pigments which are tonal to the landscape. This is the building in its context. This is obviously urban context, but this is the building in its context here. And this idea that the building almost disappears within its context, within its earth tones, was very important in the reading. As you come to the volumes, you appear very much at these very simple pavilion structures that welcome you and bring you into the form, and then bring you to its public space which overlooks the view. Everything is in the same materials that I show those materials. Timber is the only material that we use as an extra form, with obviously metal work for the joints, but essentially in terms of its composition, it's different dyes of concrete for the floors, the walls, etc. Sometimes a bit of tonality of color, and in a way, then these very, very large 10-foot, 15-foot overhanging cantilevered roofs from the structural supports, which then create all the kind of necessary overshading. There's no glare on the glass. We're able to then use the glass and insulated walls in a way that allows it to not have any heat gain. When you're on the spaces, the glass really becomes very transparent and allows this permeability. The roofs also, we spent a lot of time working to design in a way so that because we saw the form as a three-dimensional form, that there is no articulation of the idea of a roof. It is one single form. It's basically a polystyrene, using this technology now. This is a polystyrene insulated roof with a reinforced concrete slab on the top, which allows it to then seem as though the whole thing is simply made out of the ground and formed as a singularity. It works by mapping where the prevailing winds are, and those are developed as gills almost in the building, and as when they're operated, they allow the cross ventilation to allow the building to breathe very, very easily, and the building is permanently climatically always 6 or 7 degrees under the temperature of the outside sun. And this is something Kofi used almost as a sort of demonstration for not just African leaders, but also international leaders would come to talk about how architecture could be made. This is looking a little bit over one of these roofs near the terraces, where you see how the form is really seamlessly always almost becoming like a sculpture in terms of its massing and form. And then in each of the villas, which are interlocked, a different hue presents itself to you and creates the tonality of that environment, from soft, warm browns and pinks, always framing the context. And so in a way, this idea of the removal of the corridor, but the extension of the eaves, making the circulation systems into the one-volume rooms, in a way reaching back to the idea of how those traditional communities worked by making verandas or extended porches that were the interconnecting systems into the volumes. And then the arboretums, the pineapple groves and flowers. This is the pictures I was showing earlier, obviously, of the sort of early construction shots, and then now it's becoming a kind of very lush garden that's been built. Then the residential villas in their spaces as these sort of elevated volumes that then can be connected by transport or routes that sort of maneuver through them, that you circulate through them, but always have privacy and then are able to kind of get into their main paths. In 2013, I was invited to make a project in Gwangju in Korea. And South Korea is very fascinating because after the Korean War, Gwangju was a very important place that used its intellectual sort of literature student body to really support the kind of way in which they were able to make the resistance and create their democracy. So in a way, Gwangju was fascinating to me because this is a place, sort of other side of the world, completely here, where this incredible literary culture, student culture is revered. And this is a city that created a biennial where the architecture is not in an expo site anywhere, but is continually in the city, added to the city, and is seen as a continual experimentation, a place of continual experimentation, which allows the communities to be able to see how new architecture can renew and add an experimental agenda to the city. So every 2 years, a new curator is hired, a body of work is made, the work is always made in the city, and they're permanently kept and looked after by the institutions or the different groups. Nicholas Hirsch was the director in 2013, a dear friend, and he asked artists and architects to come together to make partnerships that would develop projects in the city. I then asked a dear friend of mine, Adjaye Selassie, the writer, to work with me. I wanted to work with an author rather than a visual artist because of that relationship to Korea, and I wanted to see if we could make a new kind of project for this context, reading the context from an author's point of view and from an architect's point of view. The way in which architects choose their projects is by just being sent to the city and for them to come back and make propositions based on their observations and their time there. Maybe a bit weak, but also very interesting. The gaze of a stranger in a landscape can offer new ways of seeing that landscape, which can be interesting in terms of experiments. Ty and I became very fascinated by the idea of literature and the way in which, in our sort of walks around the community, we were shocked how reverential people were with literature. Newspapers would never be thrown in the bin. They would be folded and left on a bench for somebody else to read. Books were never discarded. They would be left for other people. There were lots of book exchange, volumes everywhere. And in a city that became very dense and urbanized, it's, with very few green spaces, the river became a sort of overproduced but very important piece of nature in the city. And all sort of Gwangju residents would always spend all their time coming to the water. The water at this moment, this is the low tide, but would be able to flood right to this point at high tide. So it's a kind of an extraordinary dynamic. And in this sort of overproduced modernity, hyper-modernity, which is this sort of typical of Asian cities, a sort of longing for something of the local sort of started to appear. The city started putting these things next to the water as a kind of image of what Korea might be. And we became very fascinated by this juxtaposition between this idea of memory, a selective memory, but a memory, and this idea of a kind of the production of modernity and how it's impacting us. We decided that we wanted to make, in a culture, test to see if we could make a library without walls, an open library, that you couldn't probably do that anywhere, but maybe Korea was the one place you could make a library that had no doors, no windows, but was just a space. With Adjaye wanted to select the library. She chose a library, a local library that had a certain literature content, and we would work with that library to have 200 books to start our new sort of urban library, and that the library would then look after this structure and program it with lectures, event spaces, children's workshops, etc. And I wanted to see if we could make a rethinking of the idea of Korean craftsmanship and the collision of infrastructure, to see if we could create a new form that felt not about this kind of collage of the two systems, but maybe a new fusion that would create a new hybridity that would make a new place, that would be a new public place for the community. So instead of a kind of an accretion of objects just simply continually bombarding the landscape, maybe a way in which architecture can then intervene, even at such a small scale, to reimagine these conflicts into new forms that can become new opportunities. This was the final sort of study that I looked at, which was this idea of taking the very simple act of just going from one level to the other as a sort of amphitheater, the support for a loggia structure, a timber structure, would be then the framing, and that support would become the library shelves. And because this whole structure floods, this entire thing was to be cast out of concrete so that if the water came, it would flood to that concrete level, and the loggia would be above. These were the sort of drawings of this idea. Our pavilion cost a little bit more money than the traditional pavilion, but we were able to get the city who were building these stairs to give us the budget they would use to make local stairs to allow us to make this structure. You can see the cast form here. These are just sort of indented concrete networks with sort of Juliet balconies. And then this is a timber structure, just using computers to cut timber to different sizes and then using carpenters to pin them. So the craft is reduced, but the craft is in the assembly to then create cross-vaulting, which in a way for me was a way to speak to the way in which timber is used to create spanning structures for spaces in Korean architecture. The whole thing was stained a creosote black to allow it to really be able to survive in the context, and the concrete was sealed with a black waterproof stain. So it became a sort of abstraction of the sort of the form that you'd seen, but a kind of new figure. This is looking at where we put the structure, which is this part of the city where they hadn't built the stairs, so we were able to get that budget in a very highly dense residential area, which valued this water body as its important bucolic source. Bridges in Korea don't have railings. This is a community bridge and everybody understands it. It's a cultural thing because the river is so important and everybody wants to get to the river because the city is so dense that this is a very important thing. And we were struck by this. And in a way, what we loved was the idea that this structure, this library, or this form, this gateway, this monument to this world was on axes with this urban bridge. This is the building in its context. We built it and handed it over to the library. They filled it with books, and maybe in a different culture in the West, this would all get ripped down or vandalized. We put Wi-Fi here, and this almost instantly became the spot for the community. Kids would hang out here. Performances were happening on the theater spaces. Old people in the morning when they did their walks would come and exercise and leave papers here, their benches inside. And it suddenly took on this life that we completely hadn't planned but hoped would be activated. It also became very much a place for architects to go and look. But in a way, what was interesting was this idea of being able to take the mundane and the generic and to transform it into something and to play with this idea that can come from the specificity of reading a place. The city started to use it as a place to make presentations. The local mayor would use it as a gathering point, as a focusing device in the summer especially, when it was very, very warm, instead of being in a building to then do events. And in a way, this was very exciting to us. And the library has grown. There are more than 200 books, and it's an exchange system that goes on. And with the power of social media, we are always getting images sent to us of people who enjoy this structure. So this is the timber structure, looking at the cross-vault system of just pinning the timbers. So it's cut timbers, just pinned, and then using the computer to determine where the pinning should happen, the vaulting occurs. What was very funny for us is a year after this thing was made, the city still brought back one of these. I'm not sure if it was a criticism of us or if it was just the system in production working, but I enjoy the humor of this moment after all that effort. I'll move to Russia. In 2010, we won our very sort of first super-scaled project. In 2010, if you remember, you can cast your mind back, that was when Medvedev had won the Russian presidency, and there was a sense in Russia of an opening out to the West and a kind of connectedness, not the sort of détente that we have right now, and that there were a lot of competitions that were happening in the country. And as a young office in London, we were invited to take part in a new campus and tech environment that was being created by the city. One, to deal with Moscow, like most sort of non-Western cities, this idea of its education bodies mostly and a lot of its institutions being privately owned and not state or Russian. And this production or this problem of having most of its postgraduate course students going to the West, going to America, predominantly going to Europe, and either not returning and creating a brain drain. This Medvedev saw this as one of the projects to start to reverse the brain drain that was happening in Russia, and to see if one could create excellence in Russia and to have it become an inward bound system. He put together, this is all Medvedev at that time, put together a group of oligarchs who funded the project as a private-public partnership with the city of Moscow. It's the mayor of Moscow at that time. And the project was built. It was a very large project for me. It was almost 700,000 square foot building. If you know Moscow, if you've had a chance to go, it's a little bit like Milan. It's a very interesting city, but based on a 20th century idea of a series of concentric motorway rings that reduce right down to the Kremlin, which is in the center, the Moscow River here, weaving through it. And it's a series of suburbs which then have grown and keep growing. Our site was here, just in the new sort of suburb of the edge of the city. When we did the competition against a lot of university builders, we'd never built a university campus before. The brief was more or less a university campus. On a 27-acre site, most people defer to the traditional university model. Myself and my team sort of immersed ourselves in Russian culture and the history of its form and building, and looked at its geography and its climatic condition. This graph really tells you about the critical piece of information that I'm going to tell you. That in the spring, for a few months, it's stunning. This 27-acre site is a blossom, a sort of explosion of life and plant life. But in the winter, it is this, which is for almost 6 months of the year, and then 3 months while it thaws, this is 10 foot's worth of snow. And what was interesting is that in all the competition briefs, everybody looked at this and drew beautiful pavilions in the parks. And we looked at this and said, this is the reality, and that was an exception, and we needed to make a new piece of architecture that would understand this context and also the context of Russian architecture. So this is the typical reference point of most universities, from the monastery through to something like East Anglia University, which is the kind of the street with the avenue of schools on it. You know, the monastery, the quad, Jefferson's sort of layout of the Virginia campus, etc., or the urban campus, which is when universities are woven into our cities. And we said that none of these models were appropriate for this project. But also we felt at that time there was a kind of snubbing of the work of 100 years ago of a very amazing, important constructivist set of architects who were thinking about how a modern Russian architecture could evolve out of a real specific understanding of its context, who created incredible experimental projects that were dealing with their context. And there was an embarrassment at that time about this work, seen as either too brutal or too modern, and you know, a huge embrace of classical architecture, neoclassical architecture from Rome, this idea of the picture beautiful city rather than the responsive city. And we challenged that and said that we felt that there was something in this questioning of 100 years ago that really provided a vision for modernity around the world, and it was sad that Moscow and Russia really had very little of that architecture, and what was left was falling apart and dilapidated, but it was the huge inspiration of modern architects around the world. People like Malevich, who used early photography, really was looking at Pilot's images to make his paintings, which looked at that time like extraordinary abstractions, were really about him understanding how to use technology to think about the future. And we wanted to see if we could do the same thing. We also spoke to the Russians about the relationship of abstraction that we felt in constructivism and African pattern making, tessellating, and abstraction and sculpture and form that is, for me, mistakenly labeled as primitive, when actually it's an incredibly sophisticated methodology of encoding form with very dense pieces of information, and a way to speak about specificity through pattern making, which is one of the most primal human things that we do, which is around us and is a reflection of nature. They were quite shocked but loved the idea, and I sought to see if we could make a building, which was the first building in this campus, that was a full campus built as one building. So dorms, gyms, classrooms, schools, support facilities, all as one hyper building. So it's really the creation of a very large new type of building. Because it was a singular building on this 27-acre site, I wanted in its origin, because it's set up, to be almost like a compass. So its planning is organized as a compass that orients you when you see this building. The schools are very much placed on the southern side, and the lecturing spaces are placed on the northern side. So lecturing and exhibition on the north, schools on the south, and then communal spaces in the center. That's really the diagram of the building. This is the project diameter. It's a 1,000 feet building, 300 meter single volume that sits in a 27-acre park. And then you come to this 1,000-foot volume, go under it for parking so that it's protected from the snow. All the services systems, there are 4 different units that rise into it. And then there are ways in which the building is an extension of the landscape, bringing people up into it and over it and in it. It's built as a large raft slab. It's almost like a ship. It's a 3-meter raft slab that anchors it in the ground, which is a technology that we learned from post-war Russian engineers. I think you're in the... the 1,000-foot diameter, here's a kind of look at that. These are the different schools. So these would be campus buildings. Imagine engineering, sciences, etc. These are buildings within a building of that scale with its communal facilities. And this idea that you would make a network that would never have a dead-end corridor. It would be a circulatory system that would always observe the light between the volumes. And this was a way to make a campus so that everyone, you didn't have to go in and out all the time in that extreme weather, which was as low as minus 30 degrees in Moscow. Programmatically, it's set up so that students could drive, come into the lobbies, go to class, go into their dormitories, go into their what I'm calling the body building, which is where gymnasium, swimming pools, etc. are, without even coming outside. But there would be ample opportunities to get daylight or to be able to get onto a deck, which would allow for physical sort of activities away from the ground plane. Professionals would be able to come. It was cross-programmed with a sort of very large conferencing area, 3,000-seater conferencing area, with a 5-star hotel, which was built on the disk, which would allow for businesses and professionals to intermingle with the school, creating a kind of relationship between public and private, which is always fertile in terms of the way in which businesses see new talent, hire them, the way in which students see how the businesses are sort of operating. There's a kind of rub that is happening in this kind of what I'm calling a kindergarten environment. And then a network which is about the professionals in the school, library, facilities, etc., the executive team also having their own world. This is the building in its context. So the building is really, for me, an expression of the constructivism of that time, but built in the 21st century as one hyper building that allows this programmatic work to happen. The multi-program is unified with a set of facades which are not just simple windows, but the buildings are concrete but clad in glass tiles. There's like 15 different colors of tiles. And they're abstracted and pixelated into this motif pattern, which really speaks of east, west, north. the building in the spring is then a plinth form in its landscape. The 1,000 feet disc is a running track for all the students. And then there are a series of terrace gardens that allow the hotel or the student block to be able to kind of manipulate and use this, and the swimming pool and the staff. You're able to move from the classrooms up and down into the parks and gardens. These are 140-foot cantilevers, backspanned, moment concrete structures that we couldn't do with European engineers because they just didn't know how to work in the snow and ice. They over-engineered these buildings and wanted to make them in steel. It made the buildings so incredibly expensive that we, in the end, worked with these retired old Russian engineers who worked post-war, making the architecture post-war when the Russian army came back, who were extraordinary. They taught us how to build foundations in -30, how to create these incredible cantilevers. And we built the building for an incredible budget. The interiors are done. We were just really in charge of making the form, and a sort of a series of interior designers were brought in, so it's not all us, but we made a timber ceiling with these lights and a white stone floor as a way to reflect light deep into the form. Auditoriums with large skylights to allow daylighting or not. And then the rooms between the spaces, allowing for the different schools to be inhabited. The canteen building in the center. And then between each school, the idea of the view to the light and to the context that's around. So even though the building is an interiority, there's this blur with exteriority that's continually being played. This is a picture I love of that inhabitation in between those spaces. And this is really the heart of the school, that all the students network and are continually with each other, roaming almost in this kind of modern cloister around the school volumes, in, away from the cold, but creating future relationships which will be with them lifelong. Classrooms are modern tech classrooms, be able to be divided, daylight or not, everybody sort of on their computer screens. And then just from that sort of space, so this is the entry and arrivals, these are the classroom chambers and the ability to come out. These are then the rooms of the students' dormitories. In the Golden Building is an Olympic pool for both students and also the Russian Olympic team to rehearse. So there's also another overlap happening here. And then a large gymnasium playing with constructivist imagery, this idea of movement. The movement is kind of played in the windows. And then the exterior, this cladding system which seals the building but creates this optical effect of refractions, bounces light down to the sort of Golden Building, Western Building. And what's kind of wonderful is the school has now been going for 6 years, graduating a sort of an amazing generation of postgraduate students, and now has become a school that a lot of people from America, Africa, Europe now go to learn about the Russian sort of way of doing business, which is funny. This is a view of the building and its context within this form. We wanted to basically leave the gardens as much as possible just to create desire paths, and the building really is a sort of a form that sits within this context and allows it to breathe. There are now a series of other tech campus buildings that are right around this, and it's become a very important tech hub for the nation. I'll move you to Beirut. In 2015, I was asked by an extraordinary client to build a project in Beirut. This is the main part of the city. Beirut is one of those incredible cities on the Red Sea with its marina. It was damaged by 27 years of war and has been rebuilt recently, but has been rebuilt in this quasi-idea of public, in the sense that it's, because of the Syrian war, that it's right on its border, 45 minutes away. There's an extraordinary sense of fragility, but also a sort of Lebanese optimism about resistance to that idea of fear that's just right on their border. This is Beirut sort of up to the war, an extraordinary city of red-roofed, tiled 20s buildings. I was here as a young child. My father used to always talk to me about the red roofs of Beirut. This is before the war. It was one of the kind of key motifs of the idea of the city because of the way in which the section works. It's a coastline with a hill, and you had this fantastic views down to the avenues and beaches. This is rebuilt Beirut after the war, a modern city, but in a way gated, a lot of security, but thriving, and wanting to engage with its future. What it's done, what that sort of 27 years of war has done, is also to create a sense of a very big fear of the public world. One of the things that have obviously thrived in these contexts are malls and, the protection of those things. And essentially my client asked me to make a mall, which I've never done before. But he also has one of the biggest collections of internet art in the world, certainly in the Middle East, over 15,000 works, and wanted to share it with the public. He sort of in his malls has always put out contemporary art, extraordinary works right next to his retail moments, but wanted to see if he could build an institution where he could really present the work to the public. This is the site. It's an industrial area, sort of just outside of the city on the way to Byblos. If you know Byblos is a 5,000-year-old city and ruin, which is one of the kind of great wonders to see in this region. It mostly was gas industrial sites and industrial sheds, and we were to transform this into a new quarter. I was really fascinated by this because of this idea of the trauma of the city and this idea of dealing with something which most of the time most architects think is a little bit tacky, this idea of a shopping mall, not really very serious, but sure, we'll do it. But to see if the program of art, retail, and we talked about making a public place and adding health and wealth, health and well-being, wealth, Freudian, could make a new typology that would create a new destination for the community. And then, of course, to see if one could work with this extraordinary thing called the Red Sea, with this extraordinary history. My team I tasked my team to just take endless images of the sea, and we worked on this, and it'll make sense later. But to see if we could also understand that this city is also a Muslim city, mostly, even though it has a Christian minority. But in a way, the climatic response has been through the brise soleil, the screen, which is both a privacy device, but also a way to climatically deal with heat gain on the mass of forms, and to see if we could make a new kind of building, to understand the way in which Muslim architecture doesn't have to just inhabit the traditional realm to express its motifs, but can to see if we could translate that into the 21st century, and to see if we could find a new hybridized form, again, the same thematic. In thinking about it, also in Muslim architecture and public architecture is the idea of the majlis, which is a public room that anyone can come into to speak and to meet. And we envisaged that we could keep his existing building, this is the site, keep his existing building, make a new center, which would be both art and retail, and this new sort of refurbishment. We built out the coastline. We reclaimed the land from here to build this out into the ocean, getting permission from the state, to make a new large public plaza on the ocean, because there was simply not many places where the public could just be very close to the water. And he was prepared to pay for this to happen, to create this destination. And this is a sort of 8-lane highway, which is a terrible piece of infrastructure that cuts the waterfront from the community. And to see if one day we could, we're sort of in negotiation to get a bridge sort of made here, but to see this building almost as a gateway to this new found space, and to use this building as a kind of buffer to this traffic. The idea was to see if we could make a building which in its section would rotate itself to open itself to people and tilt to create shade to the south sort of aspect. It would be a secondary skin system which would protect the heart, creating a thermal secondary enclosure, but that would also deal with all the kind of plant and secondary issues that we needed to work with. The plan would work by making the building a gateway, splitting it directly into 1/3, 2/3 art and retail. And then to see if we can then use that as a gateway to get onto the public space of the project. And then the atrium of the retail space, if this is art, a series of a sort of arrival, double height spaces, single height spaces, 6 floors. This is the size of the Whitney, just to give you a sense of scale. Then the retail space is, I turned into what I call a kind of a large majlis, a space where you arrive into the center of this and you're into a neutral space. You don't see retail very much here, but you come into a space which is about light and space. Of course it's retail, so I shifted it, but this was the biggest fight. I have 125 of the best brands in both the Middle East and the world saying, how can you make an atrium which you close off? And literally lost the job because of this insistence on seeing if we could make a new center. And the building in its context, this was the existing building I showed you. This is the center of the city. This is the incredible highway which divides the community from it. The form of the building at the moment, because it's really a car drop-off system here, and then this idea of the diagonal which takes you in. The skin, which signifies this new form in its context. A window to Byblos in the art building, which basically allows you, as you rise up, to look towards the ancient city. And then a series of other windows which connect you to the skyline. This image really is showing how this building sits within this traffic sort of island. The health and spa spaces are up above. You come through this idea of a multi-set of buildings in this gauze, this skin, which is the climate moderator. And then inside the building, the atrium, the majlis, and the majlis space with this series of circulating escalators and a room filled with light on reflecting stainless steel, which creates this incredible space in the heart of the building. And then from there into the retail spaces, which then always, we insisted, had to have a view to the window, to the sea. This is the screen that we developed from the images of water. And it's a multi-layer system, and it really was just about looking at the movement of water and to see if we could use this idea of abstraction to just create that form. We developed it as a multi-layer system so that it had a color depth, but also would have a three-dimensionality, an optical moiring by the way in which we made the density and the figures of the form. The museum is museum quality. The work is on display and is on rotation every 4 to 5 months. This is a doorway straight into that retail space. And I really was very much sort of almost in a 2001 kind of way, tickled by this idea that you would enter worlds through gateways, literally like through doors into different worlds. So you'd move from that retail space into this or back. Somebody could shop, somebody could go look at art, you could meet in between. You would have these vignettes into the double height spaces, moving through those forms. And then you'd come into this, looking up. So playing with this double diffuse light, refracted light. This is a daylit space. And as you rise up, you see how you see no brands. And this was the fight I had. But actually what has happened is that this space has become really the majlis for the community. Events happen here, parties happen here, and all the retail spaces now use this as their public room before you get to the form. And then the health spa on the roof with its spas and suites and a rooftop pool which overlooks the city skyline, allowing ordinary residents to have a privileged view, which is the sort of preserve of penthouses. Anybody can come up here and enjoy this view or use the spa. So in a way, the project is almost a sort of way to reclaim the ground plane as a stacked urban network, a new public network within this conflicted space, which can allow different timescales to happen. It's not just about retail. It's about dining. It's about sport, running, being by the water, events. This is the new waterfront that we created that flows from the form and is a water break also for the water. And allows people to just come and enjoy this entire space and the new form in its context. So you see the hill and the coast and the water in this summary. 2 more projects for you. A project that we're working on right now, which is slightly controversial because of this word, but it's something that is a very interesting discussion that I'm very excited about. It's in Accra, in my home country, the capital of my home country, Ghana, and it's in the monumental core of the country. I was brought in by the newly elected president to think about the monumental core of Ghana. Black Star Square, if you know anything about the history of Ghana, is where independence was celebrated for Ghana and really the beginning of the liberation of the continent. This was a space that was finally built out by Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, and is probably the ceremonial heart of the nation. Its parliament is here. This is a very important axial road, and successive presidents have built conference centers. This is the Cemetery of Heroes. But in this composition, there's never been a space for the sacred or for the discussion or for the celebration, the national celebration of the spiritual. And this president has become very fascinated with that as a very important idea within the national psyche, and wanted to see if we could, it brought me in to see if we could study a way in which we could complete this monumental core and define it with this structure. I propose that we take a site which comes from the main high street of the country, Liberation Avenue, and to make a new head, a new axial park, and to place this cathedral within a new public park. And that this idea of cathedral is used as a placeholder. It's really this sort of chamber for this idea of spiritual. If you know West African culture, most of West and East African culture, but mostly West African culture, is about birth and death. I mean, every weekend on the continent, there are millions of birth and death events. And in a way, that reflection into the national didn't happen. Whenever it happened on the national stage, for instance, the death of Kofi Annan, he was in state in a conference center. And that was seen to be a very undignified way for this to happen, that it's almost like a school hall, or tents are erected in the sort of parliamentary grounds. So this building is about fulfilling something which is in the national psyche in terms of its cultural sort of operation, but also to define a monumental core. This is Parliament here, this is looking down to the waterfront. This is the site that I chose. And this is off Liberation Road, and this is the site of the new library, which then will axially lead into the Parliament building and to the Cemetery of Heroes here, creating a sort of monumental core for the country. This is that picture on Black Star Square where the great 6 who created Ghana's independence were. This is the architecture that Nkrumah used. He wanted to think of modernism, but also the architecture, the traditions of Ghana, to create the monuments of the new nation, the new independent state. He built all of what is in Ghana in 6 years. And I'm sort of astonished because it's still the infrastructure that is of the nation now in terms of resonance. In making this cathedral, I wanted to see if we could make a building beyond the idea of the word cathedral. But the cathedral is really a device to understand it as a large collective national space. But to see if we could understand what the sacred means within the Christian thinking of the country and also its traditional culture. The country is 70% Christian, but it also the Christianity is practiced through the lens of, I think, the animist culture. It's a kind of interpretation of Christianity which makes its own variant, which is very specific if you've been to it. It basically refers very directly to the Bowman culture, the chieftaincy revelation culture of mostly the Ashanti and the Ewe people, who are the dominant group in the country. And the Bowman culture is basically this idea in the chieftaincy of West Africa where on the Sunday, which is not because of Christianity, but as the calendar of the culture, the king would reveal himself to his community under the umbrella The original awnings were just fabrics, and then later they hybridize Western ideas and hybridize and make these extraordinary umbrellas that become the insignia of the revelation of the king, or the queen mother, or the queen, or the royal family, and the discussion with the court and the people. It's a very important thing that happens for every week in every chieftaincy, and depending on who's there, the pageantry is amplified or not. And in this, I thought, was the clue to the idea of making a cathedral in Ghana, but also the idea of understanding how to celebrate the sacred or the divine, and also how to see how that could intersect with the notion of Christianity, the Old Testament really, for me, being in essence the revelation of Christ and the idea that he is with us. In making the cathedral, I felt that it was an opportunity to also work with artists from the continent and specifically Ghana in the diaspora and locally. And 6 artists have been are brought together, and we are working now. And the project is really to see if we can make that cathedral form, this sort of new architecture, which I'll sort of go into more detail, use it as the anchor which connects and ties and then connects to Black Star Square, making this monumental core for the nation. The inspiration is the Bowman fabric. But now the Bowman fabric is elevated onto a podium which has public life in it. This is seen as a podium of culture, museum, music school, baptistry churches, conference center, and then a cathedral hall, which is a 5,000-seater chamber, under a series of pillowing concrete leaves, spanning 40 meters, and also 40 meters high in its center. So it's basically the Bowman revelation, but made into a horizontal form, and then a chamber, a sort of egalitarian chamber which folds around as an amphitheater to what will be the altar or the sort of specific space for ceremonies for the nation. The church, the cathedral works as a kind of axial open-ended tube facing both landscapes, both parks, glazed on either end, and then you come in and turn 90 degrees to what is the sort of heart of the space here. This is the 5,000-seater chamber. This is the elevation of the building, and you can see how, as you approach it, the main form is this sunken concrete, sort of post-tensioned structure held on 2 massive buttressing systems. And as you get towards the altar, as it were, the fabric elevates almost supernaturally to become a peak on the axes of the altar and then descend. And at that moment, you have this extraordinary 40-meter vault in the center of the form, and then you see the plinth and its crypts and underspaces. From the street, you only see the low section and don't see the kind of cresting form. You see a building as a double plinth, almost these folded leaves of concrete which hang in the air, billowing, and as you drive past or walk past, you're able to see it, and as you're on the plinth, you're able to go behind it. And the sense is to try and see if we can make the structure really follow this idea that 21st century technology can allow us to use post-tensioning systems to then create that. This leaf structure also creates our thermal and solar shading for the monolith of the structure and the glazed interior aperture. And the roof is a double cavity system. It's a series of trusses that are interconnected, stacked together to create this incredible sort of musical sort of roof form which allows light to pierce in different densities into the main space. But this double cavity allows us to be able to cross-ventilate from the edges to allow the heat gain to not get into the hall. And we use a labyrinth system in the ground by cooling the low air and then letting it rise up through the amphitheater to cool the space. So it's a naturally ventilated space. The form comes on the ground, on the street, So the basement, this is the main sort of plinth with its conferencing spaces, baptistry churches, museums, schools, sort of music schools, back of house supports. As you rise, you come onto the main chamber, which is the hall with its sort of glazed sort of space, the two plinths that come onto it, the program base and the empty hall. And then the concrete leaves, which fold over the entire form, creating this new chamber, which actually aligns with this new landscape and then creates the form. And then that's the building in its context. Landscape gardens are made to connect right through to the Cemetery of Heroes, then creating a monumental landscape and a rechanging of the tarmac to then create a symbolic relationship to Black Star Square. And the idea is that this will be the first park since Nkrumah's time, 60 years of the nation. Really, this will be the first major park built in the country. And this will be the first major building built that is not about the everyday. It's really the first building to be built since Nkrumah's time of the imagery of nation building that is really about a way in which the culture might see itself in the 21st century, its aesthetics and its image of itself in the future, which is really essentially the kind of premise of the project for the president also, not only to create this idea of the sacred, but to use it as a vessel to imagine a nation beyond aid, which is his manifesto for Ghana. This is a sort of up at the top of the plinth, and then inside the chamber. And you see how the trusses create the apertures. These are the truss forms, create the apertures and create the stack effect ventilation that kind of move out. And the building when it's in the evening when it's finished. Lastly, I'm going to end on a project that I completed in 2016 that was referred to, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The Smithsonian project is really a dream project for me, a competition win a decade before its completion, 8 years before its completion, 2009. And it's really to build the last possible building that can be built on the Washington Mall. It's a 200-year plan by L'Enfant, the great master planner of Washington. And the master plan idea was to have culture on one side. These are the cultural monuments. The Smithsonian is probably one of the greatest treasure houses in the world. And the memorial grounds of the nation, surrounding the nation's key legislative bodies, the executive, Congress, the archive, etc. This is the idea of the National Museum of African American History and Culture has been a conversation for 200 years. Since the Declaration of Independence, African Americans fighting in the American War wanted a representation of their contribution to the making of America. It was always denied. It was always suppressed. Different states built their own African American museums, but without the sort of support of the state, these were really simulacrums, theatrical simulacrums of the ideas of the community from slavery, the Great Passage, the agrarian South, and the migration to the urban centers and the transformation of America. The museum, now in the 21st century, is a museum not about the traditional things that a museum has, artifacts of edification and such like, but these are fragments of the 20th century predominantly, and of the past, which have a providential value, which are meant to be used as devices to tell the story that allows people to get into the narrative of the contribution of this community. People always ask, how a Ghanaian boy won this competition and how is it relevant that I could be doing it? And I always laugh because this is one of my favorite photos on my desk. And if you know the characters, that's Malcolm X, that's Nkrumah, it's Adam Clayton Powell, etc., Martin Luther King. These guys went to school together and actually were in a network with each other and understood each other. It was seen as a great struggle, not just in America, but as a kind of continental idea of black emancipation. The museum's content, as I said, is with things that are seemingly don't have value. The first voting slip of a black family, Rosa Parks' dress that she wore that day she was on the bus, that she resisted to get up for a white passenger who insisted she gets up on an empty bus. Shackles, of course, or a hymn book of Harriet Tubman, who was the great resistance woman. I always love this image by the Du Bois Institute to talk about the sort of extraction from the 15th century, the 500-year extraction from the continent of Africa to South America and North America and the Caribbean. You know this, I'm sure, but it's really predominantly West and Central Africa because it was a commodity. We know the numbers, but we don't know the cultural definition because that wasn't important when they came to this side, but we know the numbers. And of all the sort of probably 25 million people that were extracted over those 500 years, 12 million were the ones who settled, 9 here, about 2 to 3 million in the Caribbean, and 500,000 in America. In making this museum, I felt that I owed it to the history of this traumatic story to refer back to the dignity of the geography, the forest, from which the people predominantly came, and the great skill of the abstractionists of the forest who made the shrines and temples specifically in the Yoruba culture, who were in the 15th and 16th century undoubtedly understood as the master craftsmen of Africa. Their influence affected many of the tribes in a way that is absolutely clear. 500 years before this time, they were the master casters, had mastered figuration. The great Benin bronzes were incredible figuration. The Nok civilization 2,000 years before was a clay civilization of figuration. By the 15th century, they have adopted abstraction because this is a time of empire and complexity, and used geometry and abstraction to create the extraordinary motifs that are part of the shrine architecture. Anybody from that time would have known the shrine architecture because that was the most sacred buildings in those cultures, apart from the Palace of the Kings. And it felt, in making a narrative in my mind, if one could make an architecture that was about this caryatid, this way in which the caryatid is wearing a crown and is embodied with the narrative of his entire life within one sculpture, maybe this was a way to make a museum that was no longer about the Western canon of a palace with objects in it, but an object which embodied the very story and communicated it out in the landscape. That the way to talk about the contribution of Black Americans was to talk through simply their labor and not even to be conjectural in the debate, that the architecture of the South and most of America, of Washington, of the White House, is built by black slaves. People have denigrated immigrants forever, we know, but these people were the people who were from the Yoruba worlds, from those great skills, and they became the great craftsmen of the South, sand casting things which were made in the North in factories, in precasting systems. These were handmade by Africans who became African Americans in the South, who made the architecture of Charleston and Louisiana and built the bridges, the canals, the irrigation systems, the farms. They weren't done by the Europeans, they were done by the African slaves. We have an image that the slaves were sort of docile and dumb and just picked cotton. They were used as a workforce. They were a valuable workforce. And so this extraction of skill from this 15th century culture to this place of labor, for me, was critical in the expression of the building. The building, as I said, is the last building on the mall. This is the mall here, and this is our site. It is half the size of any other museum. We were given a half site and had to develop a building which is the same program as all these full sites. We sought, that for me was used as the device to justify this new form too, because I said, we will no longer make this palace, we will make a new form. And the form was a vertical system that would go into the earth and rise above. What I loved about the site is that it acted as a panoptic lens to look at all the executives' branches of and memorials of the nation. It looks at the White House, it looks at Washington's monument, it looks now at Martin Luther King's monument, it looks at Abraham Lincoln, it looks at Jefferson, it looks at the mall with all its cultural monuments, it looks at Congress, the National Archive. And I chose 9 windows that frame these 9 sort of moments that are the architecture, the apertures of the figure of the building. The building is housed as a system within a system with these 9 windows that look out. So instead of making a central atrium or a heart, you are forced to go round the architecture of the object spaces, which are 3 volumes, 1 underground, 2 above ground. You parade around them and enter into them. And in parading around them in this climatic moderator, you get these views and these vantage points, but also you get a way to understand the content with its context. This is a cross-section looking at how the building works. So this is one of the main volumes, History Below, which goes down 80 feet into the ground. And then the other 2 spaces in the light spaces, exhibition spaces, are up here. Genealogy libraries and research facilities are here. And this is the main central hall, which is a free space that cuts through the building, allowing the old paths to pass through. You're able to just walk through this building as a kind of free space. This is the building in its context now. And I love this winter image when the trees are down and you see this dark bronze building within this context. This is the building. It's a bit fuzzy in the screen, but this is the building on High Street. This is 15th, looking down. The building is a solar building. It's about the light. This is south-facing, and you're seeing the lenses that frame the different views. As you come close, you see that the building is really a redrawing of the Charleston ironwork, but made into a network that is a new matrix that is made to have different densities to protect the building from different heat gains and apertures and lenses. It's a sort of drawing of where people are and where people are not to reinforce either windows or to allow views to occur by opening the lace. And then a porch, which is the architecture of West Africa, but also becomes the architecture of the South, is interpreted as a large canopied form that allows you to come close and rest before entering the building, and also climatically shift the temperature by 6 or 7 degrees using evaporative cooling and stack effects by not connecting to the back of the building to create a welcome to the front, which is distinctly different to the welcome of the other buildings. It's the last moment before you go onto the memorial grounds, and in this sort of midday heat has become the welcome space. It's become almost its own space, independent of the museum's operation, which I love. The interior of the museum is this room that you can cross from north to south, and then you descend down 40 feet into the first volume, which has no light, which is about history, where people are then taken down, and you go to the very bottom, and you are brought through the history of slavery right through to the Declaration of Independence. This is an image of Jefferson and his black slaves and the slaves that he owned. This is the stack of the cards of the slaves that he owned. So the contradiction and the paradox of liberty is the first image of this museum. What is amazing in this museum, which is something that was very powerful, is that anything that is about a representation of a person is never a realistic one. It's never Disneyfied. It is taken back as a tone, and all the images you see that are real, as it were. So there is a sense that you're looking not at a made-up history or an invention, but as history and storytelling in its clearest, most scientific sense. And that it's not a sort of thematic where you can't go back, but it's a stack where you can see everything from the civil rights right through to the beginnings of sort of the agrarian South. You're looking at a ring of the slaves that were taken from the copper work on binding brooms was used by slaves when they were not allowed to marry. That's what they used as a way to kind of signify their marriages. These are reconstructions of literally the dismantling of slave huts from the south and rebuilt in the museum. These are all real artifacts. This is a real train, the segregation civil rights trains, where blacks were not allowed to sit, which was refurbished and brought and dropped into the building before we sealed it and can never be taken out. And then as you move through the different layers of history, sort of in this main large volume, we tiered it into three, from the agrarian to the civil rights to now. So it's a summary of the entire museum is in this history gallery without light. You were able to come in looking, using technology to to make the narrative and to deal with the communication of the story, from real artifacts to technology, and that's seamlessly being woven across the whole thing. The lunch counter is turned into a digital book, which is playing for people to understand that time. This is the Angola guard tower that shot many people in Louisiana. And the people arriving are here looking back. So it's a kind of postmodern construction where you're able to see everything. And that was really important in the way we wanted to have this museum work. You see everything from the lynchings, which are really traumatic, through to Emmett Till's coffin, where the mother insisted that the coffin was open so that people could see her child's face that was brutalized for flirting apparently with a white girl. Through to listening at the end to the inauguration of Obama. And usually what happens when people have done that first part, they're really traumatized and distraught, and they've only done a third of the museum. So I decided to we added a program which was to develop this space, which is the heart space of the building, which is a 30-foot room lined in bronze, laminated in glass. With the dedication of Martin Luther King, we are determined to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream, made into a physical form, an internal waterfall that discharges into the space that's so loud that you sit in silence, and in a way the material element of the African American community is water, the Middle Passage, the agrarian landscape. And then you rise from that space, when you've finished, up into the light. And you rise into the corona body and go into the second unfolding, which is the space of the migration to the cities and the beginning of the professional classes, the early 20th century, from those spaces into these. In that, you start to see how the professional classes of the community evolve and grow, their contributions to everything in America. This is the Serena and Venus Williams. From sport to the military, everything is played out. And always the windows are working with the exhibits. So this is Washington's monument, the first general of America, and all the black generals and soldiers to date of America. The windows are using computer technology developed so that we can actually get you to look directly at the monument in full shaft when you come right next to it. It reveals the entire shaft to you. And then in the upper levels, finally, the way in which the culture, through its subjugation, but also its own overcoming of it, transforms the culture, creates and invents a new culture, changes America, and also, I would argue, changes the world through its struggle. The visual arts, the performing arts, and then finally, after that third chamber, you are brought to an overview of the mall and the sort of Juliet balcony, which gives you these views to the sort of highest point of the city, looking over the mall, looking back at where people have come from. And it gives you the most privileged view all the way to Arlington of the city of DC. And then when you finish in the evening, the reflecting pool and its light, looking back at Washington, the angle of this pyramid, which for me is very ironic because this is Africa. This is the needle of Karnak made into a giant form. So this is Egypt coming back, which is connected to the Yoruba, and this building's angles are exactly the same. this is 17.5 degrees, and I made the building's angles 17.5 degrees. So the building fuses with its context, creating a building that is at once not about the place, but absolutely about the place, creating a new dialogue. And then no building in Washington is allowed to be lit, but my building's circulation's on the perimeter, and it's a perforate structure. So I introduced all the safety lights on a punched grid on all the circulation systems. So my building lights up at night, the only building on the Washington Mall. Thank you.
Okay, so you can, I will use this mic and you can go and use it.
Okay.
Yes. I think we need to give another round of applause. That was absolutely fantastic. So we're not going to let him leave so easily. He has to answer some questions. So I'm going to ask people to raise your hands, and I will point at you, and we have people with mics. Before we go on, though, I just want to recognize, let you all know we have a live stream audience, and I just want to recognize them because they're out there watching us, and I hope that they enjoyed it as much as we did. Okay, so let me see. I see one hand here, the gentleman right next to you here. Is there anyone else to take? We have Professor Adjaye there. Okay, so we'll start here. Go right ahead. Before you start, can I ask everyone to keep your questions to the point, so that as many people as possible can ask questions, okay? Thank you.
I said, David, as people, we always want to know the price of things, but we don't always want to know the value of things. Mm-hmm. As an architect, would you care to comment?
What an amazing question. Or statement. No, I agree completely with you. I mean, for me, architecture is not about, we've sort of become sort of in neoliberal capitalism and the way in which the late 20th century has evolved. We've sort of become obsessed in the techniques, as was said by the introduction, obsessed in the techniques of what architecture can do rather than what architecture can mean for us and how it can help us imagine our futures. I'm very interested in the latter because I think in the industrialization of architecture, we've conquered the ability to make rapidly a lot of form. What we have lost in that industrialization is how to make meaning out of the industrialization of the form that we've made. And I think that the 21st century, at this time, the opportunity of the generations coming is to capture that again, because the confidence that's required to make the built environment that we would all feel proud of will be lost if this generation does not pick up, for me, this issue. Because we can either move into a world that looks exactly the same because industrialization has made it the same, and it can cost ever more and ever more and ever more billions of dollars. Or we can find a way to change this paradigm and to bring another value to what architecture has done for 10,000 years. It's our first, as civilization, architecture is the first great technology before the iPhone. It is really, truly the first great technology, and it was made to give us an idea of a collective and a sense of our future. That was why we came together, to be safe and to kind of have this thing called architecture. And I think there is a responsibility that we have as architects to this idea still, that we are not just building for clients, but we're also building for the city and also for the idea of civilization.
Thank you. There's another gentleman over there.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. Your African American Museum, you privilege the contribution of the spirituality of the Yoruba people. But the project you did for Ghana, you privilege the cross, the Christian cross, as a central part of the outside landscape. How do you reconcile those two things?
Oh, you mean the cross on the...
Yes.
Well, because I think that what's really fascinating about Africa is this idea that somehow Christianity is a double thing, right? It is 70% of the population is Christian, but also at the same time, they're connected to their past. So there is a sense that the religion of the nation is Christian, but I absolutely play that paradox in the project because the reference of the building is not from the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is from the Bauman. I've literally invented that because of the hybridity of the condition. So you have a duality. And I don't think it's my responsibility to somehow answer the question, but it's my responsibility to play the paradox in front of the society. And maybe in 200 years, the cross might not be there. But is it my choice to make that now? No, because it's 70% Christian. But what I can do is to make the architecture that actually reflects rather than creates a mimicry of something. And that's what I'm trying to do.
I think there was, I can see a gentleman up here. There's a young lady, yes, here, and then there's a gentleman and lady here, and a gentleman behind there. So please go ahead.
Hi. I'm an architect in training, a young architect, so this is really exciting for me. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
My question is also about the cathedral project. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the process of actually realizing a project like this, in terms of everyone involved and maybe other projects like this that you have experience with. How do you reclaim a space in a city that looked like a pretty dense city maybe, without negatively disrupting what is actually already on the site? And I feel like this is a problem that can be applied to any developing city. And since I have no experience with this, I'm really interested in how you can give back to the city in such a way when there's already things happening on this site.
Well, I mean, something like the cathedral is a national project. So the identification of the site belongs to the government. And what is on the site are some judiciary buildings, which are to do with the judiciary. They're homes for judges. And there was the embassy of Mali, but it's moved, a passport office, etc. So really, what was interesting about it for me was that that site was under the jurisdiction of the government and could easily be transformed in terms of its land title back to the people. At the moment, it is a site that you cannot access. And what's happening is that we are using the opportunity to create a site that everyone can access. But what is important is that the image of democracy is interesting, especially in a young democracy, because it can either be gated and behind a wall, or it can be a place that is also a focusing device. And I think that what is happening on this project is that there's a government that is realizing that we need this image of our democracy beyond just it being enshrined in its law, but also physicalized as an idea which deals with both our left and right side of our minds or our body and spirit, the kind of way in which we kind of want to express ourselves. So there is a will to see if that can be manifest. Now, of course, there's not a single project that I've shown here where resistance wasn't part of it. So let me not fool you into thinking that everything just happens very beautifully in a 15-minute conversation or 25-minute conversation. Every single project is a huge fight. But I think that anything new, quite rightly, has to be questioned, and quite rightly has to be debated. In Ghana, the huge debate is, shouldn't we spend the money on making a new school? A very, very good question. But when you don't understand what the government is doing, I mean, it's a question that sort of assumes that you understand how to pull the levers yourself. You're the surgeon, and everybody can be. But this is a government who is investing and creating an acceleration that is something completely new. And it's trying to explain that to its audience, but saying that there are going to be many things happening at the same time. It's created the best investment, the sort of oil investment of the country to the education. It's building hospitals, but it also wants to build and understand that architecture can be used as a way to imagine a future. And architecture has always been used to do that, from the Acropolis in Greece to the Caryatids of Africa to the Egyptian monuments. It's what architecture is really good at doing. And he's using an old tool to just replay this game.
We had a question.
Oh, whatever you say.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your very rousing and insightful presentation. My question is about something you referred at the beginning. You were looking for a reason to practice architecture.
Yes.
After your journey across the African continent and your experiences with these buildings, how much closer are you to your answer?
Don't forget the Freudian slip.
What do you think? That journey, I must say, was, as I said, was for me profound, because it really changed my sense of what architecture could do, or what architecture could be, and has made me want to work in the public realm. I chose a practice where I sort of played down, and we don't do much commercial work deliberately, and we work within the education sector and the cultural sector, because I'm very interested in the role in which architecture plays within the public realm and how it can imagine new publics, essentially. So I hope that what I'm showing you shows that it had a profound effect, and it's still my inspiration as I sort of go into the next decade of my life with my work.
Okay, the next question is from the gentleman sitting next to my friend, Professor Adjaye, who is also from Ghana. I'm just giving him a shout out.
So David, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Mellifluous voice. Introducing heroic, poetic, beautiful sculptures. I'm interested in two things: your domestic architecture and your experience of working in Trinidad.
Well, that was supposed to be off limits.
It wasn't me.
But the work, I could do another lecture where I show you how my lessons that's why I showed one house, maybe. I wanted to show you that, in a way, the early studies for how I got confidence to make larger forms comes through the residential architecture. And I could do a whole lecture which shows you the beginnings of that experimentation. Testing material science, looking at environmental strategies. All my early work, and still even the residential work I do now, is about testing those experiments. What's beautiful about residential work is that with the right patron, you're able to consolidate very concisely a single amazing idea into one project that can really be tested and completed as a full form, which can then help you with your clarity. The problem with architecture is that we don't have any space to practice. There's no prototyping room. We make models and then we make buildings. And in a way, I always say to my students, the testing of scales, making small objects in the city, or making slightly larger objects, or maybe residential projects, can be really amazing arenas to deliver the functionality, but also to test questions about material science, environmentalism, form making, etc. So it's another lecture. Maybe I come back another time.
Okay. Gentleman up there.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really outstanding lecture. I wanted to ask you in regards with sustainability and carbon neutrality, and how do you see that in the future in buildings? And because you spoke about it, about carbon footprint in the early part of the lecture, but I wanted to, I'm very interested in to find out, where do you see that in the future, and where do you see your buildings going in the future in regards to carbon neutrality?
I think it's the other biggest question. I think that the question about carbon neutrality is about how we move an industrialized construction industry to a sustainable construction industry. I think that architects are already there. I'm ready to build a carbon neutral building. I just can't find the products to do it. I can build unique special buildings as carbon neutral buildings, or I can use a lot of technology to compensate that. I'm more interested in seeing if we can push sustainability and form making to be seamless, not to be badges, into an idea of architecture that moves forward. So I've recently been working with the Concrete Federation about how they're now trying to do carbon capturing to bring down their CO2 delivery, which is a huge problem, and we all speak to them about it, to nothing. And they are about 10 years away from it, they say. Sort of the leading specialists. They're 10 years away because it's all about the way in which that you can capture that carbon and use it for other things, so you're not releasing it. So I think that in a decade, we're looking at a different material discussion. So there is a conversation about the representation of carbon neutrality through new forms now, or the pushing that we all have to make as architects in the way we specify materials and the agendas that we push to make sure that the industry is responding, is bending to us. And we have to bend it. We bent it to industrialize because we wanted to build more around the world. Now we need to bend it to be completely zero. And that's the future that's coming now. So I sort of feel like we are the generation, my generation right now, we are the generation that are pushing things like LEED. Every single building I've showed you was a groundbreaking LEED building, gold or platinum. But I don't talk about it. Each single building that I've showed you.
All right, we have a gentleman over here. Oh, we have a down here first, and then we'll move to you. And then I think the last question we'll take was a young lady over there. Right, so these three. And then
thank you very, very much for that. One of the things to me that stands out and is very special and dear to me from what I've seen is your connection with artists, whether they be writers, painters, and how you've sort of used them to not impose yourself on the space, but to create a greater understanding so that the building sits and lives and breathes in that space. Can you speak to us, and I mean really speak to us, because we live in a space that doesn't celebrate intersectionality, or there's not much interdisciplinary, giving. I would say that, and I hope everybody understands what I'm saying. Can you speak to us about that? Because we need to be spoken to about that.
everybody's nodding.
I think that a culture that is disconnected from its artists is a lost culture.
Yes.
There's some people say that artists are like the deep sea divers. They're the ones that can hold their breath and go down. Most people can't. And they're the ones who go search for treasure and bring it up. From my earliest moments, in fact, I would almost say, that the person who I dearly love is in this room. And he's really the reason I started making architecture the way I did. He probably doesn't even know. But I've always been inspired by artists. That artists have driven what I do. They've driven me to question what I do and to make sense of why I do it. Because artists always ask that question. And for me, in every project, especially when there are complex projects, I'm always inspired to bring in artists because of the view and the way in which they think. They think not like technicians, they think about people pondering civilization, pondering meaning, pondering how we should move into the future. It's what they do all day long. All day long. It's like an amazing resource. And people just sort of think they're decoration. They're the kind of amazing resource that are underused in our society. You shouldn't use an artist as decoration. That's the most insulting thing you can do. You should use an artist as a thinker, a fellow collaborator in an idea, and really let them do what they do. That's when magic happens.
Yeah, coming back to the carbon neutrality point.
Sorry.
I'm here.
Oh, hi.
I wanted to share with you, in the Kennedy shirt here, I wanted to share with you that 25 years ago in Sydenham in South London, when I was in a different life as a project manager in a housing association, we achieved the target of getting the highest possible marks for the PRIAM, the highest possible marks for NHER. Those are technical terms about how you measure the carbon neutrality. It was not phrased at that time. And the homes we built, 17 homes in a terrace, matched the Victorian homes on either side. So they weren't looking strange, and they were affordable. They were affordable to live in, they were affordable to build in, and they were environmentally sustainable. The architect was our colleague, Mark Raymond. My cousin is in the audience. We had a friend and a colleague called Audley English from Jamaica. And the environmentalist who helped us was an Englishman from North London called Norman Beddington. And I was the project manager. And that was outstanding, and it was a piece of work that's reproducible, in my view. So just putting it out there, it's been done on a small scale. We could go for it again. So that's it.
Okay. All right, thank you. Do you want to respond to that, or just a question?
I think he said everything.
He said everything, yes. Okay, so we'll take our last question now. Go ahead.
Good evening, Sir David. Thank you so much for your presentation. I heard bits and pieces of my question in other people's questions. But your architecture is undeniably amazing. But what's more interesting to me is the mindset that produces that architecture. I got glimpses of it when you spoke of your upbringing and also your personal studies. But what's interesting to me is, what do you do now as you're renowned all over the world to continue to develop your mindset, your worldview? What are the practices you've adopted to make yourself a better architect?
You know, I think for me, it's not a series of techniques. It's an attitude. I think that attitude is really important. I have, you know, I was lucky enough to have had this upbringing that allowed me to experience so many things, and luckily I was very engaged with those things. I found them fascinating. And I think that what feeds me and keeps me and inspires me is that open attitude towards the world, towards things. I'm not interested in the hierarchy or the sort of relevance of things. I'm just interested in the understanding of things. So for me, one of the great privileges of the 21st century is being able to see different places, go to different communities and understand things, and to look always from their lens. Because if you look from that lens as much as you can, you learn things that you absolutely didn't know. And that is, I can't do it enough. It's a lifelong quest. It's incredibly fulfilling. And it's about this open engagement, always to be open. And I think the minute I close that down, I will become formulaic and I will probably become a terrible architect. But I hope that I don't, because for me, it's my North Star. And it's what allows me to question every single project. There's not a single project that looks like the next one, deliberately, because in every moment of getting a project, I'm interested in questioning everything again. And to see what I can learn from things and what I can use, of course, but always how to kind of restart again. And the restarting is not, it's not efficient, but it's not about being, dropping what you understand. You always learn from you always move from where you build from. But this idea of sort of always going in, not knowing what it is, deliberately, stop. I always say to my students, don't draw when you have a project thought in your mind. Actually spend more time listening. Listen until the point where you can't listen anymore, then start drawing. And it's amazing how much more flows through you. So this idea of being able to allow yourself to be more immersed in things and to then work from that is deeply inspiring, and it's what I love doing.
So I'm now inviting Mr. Mark Raymond to the stage. Mark is an architect and lecturer in our Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and he's going to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Christine. That was a really very compelling afternoon, and I've been asked to make some closing remarks and give a vote of thanks. And after I've done this, there are going to be two small presentations to Sir David. So when I've finished, and then I think Christine is going to close off. That was such a beautiful talk, and thank you very much. Really very inspirational and very beautiful talk in many ways. I think from my reflection, from what you've been talking about. What you've brought to our discourse here is the importance of having a considered approach to design, to the importance of reflection and research and creativity and the imagination, what that brings to culture and brings to our life. I think we have a tendency here, and in many places in the world, perhaps to focus a little bit too much on the bottom line and the economics of building. And of course, those are important things, but I think what you've brought here today is the absolute importance of the imagination and creativity, and I'd like to thank you for that. I think we have in this country, in this region, really enormously talented architects. I've been involved with architectural education in the region for the last 25 years, and I really hope that your contribution, we had a very good friend of yours here earlier this year, Professor Leslie Locko, a fellow Ghanaian. We need to develop this discourse. We need to develop ways of talking about design, talking about architecture, and talking about the value that brings to society. And again, thank you very much for allowing us to continue that discourse. And also thank you for the university, to the Chancellor, Robert Bermudez, to the Vice Principal, Indar Ramnarine, for being here today and supporting this really very wonderful event. The university, something that I'm involved with, is trying to develop a capacity in the discipline of architecture through a number of initiatives. Thank you very much to the Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects, Ronald Ammon, and the executive membership. Jaspal Bogal, who is here representing the Board of Architecture of Trinidad and Tobago, thank you for your support. I know Ansa McCall, Able Building Solutions, have also contributed greatly to this. To Professor Christine Carrington and her team for making this possible, and what a great, wonderful turnout. And I should add that we've been meeting and discussing this for quite a few weeks, and for those of you who are not aware of this, this is actually being live streamed and is being watched. I was getting messages from Belize, from Barbados during the course of this, asking if they could move the camera so that they could see the screen. So, you know, the impact is wider than this room. Thank you very much for your team and for all the technical staff at UE for making this happen and such a successful event. I don't think I'm forgetting anybody. To my fellow colleagues, faculty members, and to everybody who's been part of this really wonderful experience. I hope that it informs continued discourse on this. We hope to host additional events, further events. We hope at some point, David, you can come back to us and keep our conversation going. And thank you very much. So there are now two presentations we would like to proceed with. So if I could ask Ronald and Sir David to come up to the stage. We are presenting, the TTIA are presenting Sir David with honorary membership of our institute, and that's something that we do with people who we recognize have made a contribution. So and then the take some more photos. Okay, and then the other presentation is going to be Professor Indar Ramnarine, who is the Deputy Principal of the St. Augustine campus of the University of West Indies, and that is a distinguished open lecture plaque that is to be presented to Sir David. Great, thank you so much. So now I'm going to hand you back to Professor Christine Carrington, who will close this evening's event.
All right, so I think we've all had a thrilling evening. I could have been here by myself in the audience listening to this, but it's very nice to have all of you here as well. Okay? So all that is left really is for me to say thank you for everyone for coming. We've really enjoyed having you here. I want to make a little announcement. Those of you who received red and white parking passes, please meet Miss McCarthy downstairs to the right of the foyer. She's the young lady who greeted you at the LRC car park earlier when you came. Okay? And to everyone else, I just Once more, thank you. Have a very safe journey home, and we hope to see you again at UE for our next lectures. Thank you very much.